Hello, everyone. My name is Caroline Williams, and I direct the Open Executive Education portfolio here at University of Oxford Saïd Business School. Thank you very much for joining us. We're a business school that has been committed to a responsible business agenda for many years. More recently, like many of us, we have anchored a lot of our work to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly inspired by its very humble purpose, not to leave anyone behind. While research has shown progress towards targets associated with these goals has been made, the events in the past year have naturally shone a harsh light on some of the inequalities in our society. Unfortunately, it has been plain to see people are being left behind. Even more worrying is that we're losing ground on SDG 1, and extreme poverty is expected to rise for the first time since 1990. There is clearly more work to do. This first in a series of programs gives us an opportunity to look closer at SDG 10, reducing inequalities. In this first episode, kindly hosted by Zainab Keba, we will put a spotlight on albinism, a condition which attracts misunderstanding and massive discrimination. And we are thrilled to be joined by Scott and Terry Sue of the Sesame Street Workshop team, an educational series I suspect most of us might be familiar with. The series has been at the forefront of helping to destigmatize health conditions such as AIDS and has provided early childhood education for Syrian refugees in partnership with the MacArthur Foundation. Welcome, Scott and Terry Sue. Also joining us is healthcare specialist Stephan Bognar from NYDG Foundation, who is live from Cambodia, where he is currently assessing how local villages in rural, remote areas are building sustainable and inclusive communities. And we're delighted to welcome model and actress Diandra Forrest, who, with Stephan, leads the Colorfull campaign shared with you on our website, both aiming to shape a collective response to the discrimination and violence individuals with albinism face around the world. Welcome, Stephan and Diandra. Before we get into the discussion, may I please share with you two words that really stand out in this conversation. The first is culture. Good leaders understand that embracing diversity is not just about hiring, as important as that is. It's about enabling a culture in which a diverse workforce can thrive. And it's about reflecting that culture inside and outside the organization. We suggest it's not enough to be diverse if you aren't thinking about the impact you're having on society. The second word is courage. Sometimes we need to be bold enough to accept criticism and bold enough to change the priorities that drive us forwards. As the health and economic fallout from COVID-19 threatens our progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, we need urgent action in order to unlock opportunities and help access the challenges the world faces. This series will give us a chance to think with clarity on how we can navigate the challenges ahead and turn them into opportunities. I hope you enjoy it. Over to you, Zainab.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Intersectionality and Inclusion series here at Saïd Business School, the University of Oxford. I'm Dr. Zainab Kaba. I am the Associate Director for Programs at the Seoul Center for Social Entrepreneurship here at the Business School. The Saïd Business School believes that business is a vital part of the systemic challenges related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In this series, we explore the necessary but hard work of individuals and organizations attempting to engineer more equitable and inclusive societies. What are the concrete steps and measurable goals they undertake? What challenges do they encounter? What is their advice for leaders and businesses who are looking to continue or even begin actioning diversity and inclusion in their work? With that, I would like to introduce our panel. To begin, Stephan Bognar is the Executive Director of the New York NYDG Foundation, one of the leading health organizations working with vulnerable and marginalized groups across the globe. Secondly, Scott Cameron is the Executive Producer for Ahlan Zimzim, an all-new local version of Sesame Street designed for children affected by displacement in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Terry Sue Fraser is Senior Producer on Takalani Sesame, which is the South African adaptation of Sesame Street. And finally, Diandra Forrest is an African-American model, actress, and if you'll allow me to say activist, She became the first female model with albinism to sign a deal with a major US modeling agency when she was 18 years old. To learn a little bit more about the panel and their work, I would like to ask you to please watch the following 2 videos to help you engage in the conversation.
Why are you singing happy birthday to me?
I'm not singing happy birthday to you. I'm singing happy birthday to the letter U.
No matter who you are and where in the world you're from, chances are you'll be familiar with these guys. In 1969, Sesame Street set off on a one-of-a-kind mission to make preschool education fun, effective, and available to children from all backgrounds. But it wasn't just numbers and letters that Sesame Street felt was key to children's development. And it wasn't just about having a laugh. Their stories and characters weave together a special world where being caring and kind to others is a top priority.
Gee, I hope she's going to be okay.
And in this world, everyone belongs, no matter where you're from or the colour of your fur. Soon enough, Sesame Workshop, the non-profit behind the much-loved TV show, began reaching beyond the small screen. The Muppets travel all over the world, championing diversity, equality, and inspiring children in all kinds of life situations. It was in this inclusive spirit that Scott Cameron co-created Ahlan Simsim, broadcast throughout the Middle East. Working with local experts, they created a new show that was both captivating and funny, but also relevant and real. The show was specifically designed for children affected by displacement, and each episode deals with the hardships they face every day.
I don't like sirens. Sirens mean there's an emergency.
That's true, but there's no need to be frightened. Sirens also mean that someone is on the way to help.
Oh.
As usual, the Sesame Muppets are there, entertaining and educating their audience off-screen as well. Scott also oversees various global outreach programs, including impact work in South Africa. On the ground there is Terry Sue Fraser, who oversees the creative production of Takalani Sesame, the regional version of Sesame Street. More than half of South African children do not have access to quality education and look to the program for support. A lot of the humor and style is similar, but as usual, it is catered to its specific audience. Takalani Sesame uses many of South Africa's official languages and has also raised awareness and tolerance around topical subjects, such as HIV and AIDS. Even after 50 whole seasons, Sesame Street continues to connect with its audience in a tangible and inclusive way. You'll hear more from our guests now on how they do this, all the while spreading joy and happiness in the lives of preschoolers all around the globe.
Make a wish.
I wish I wasn't here.
No, not you, Bert.
Oh, you.
Tell me how to get to Sesame Street.
Beauty is skin deep. Beauty is skin deep. When you see people with albinism or anyone that's different, I think it's important for people to go deeper than what's on the surface.
Diandra Forrest is a model, actress, and activist. Growing up in a largely Latino and African-American neighborhood in the Bronx, she often felt like what she described as being a black girl in a white girl's body.
I had neighborhood friends who asked my older brother if I was adopted. There were lots of times where I felt different. In school, even just on the train, there would be parents, adults, who stared at us and laughed at us.
But Diandra's parents were very supportive and gave her all the strength she needed to believe in herself. At the age of 14, she knew she wanted to be a model. And sure enough, a few years later, Diandra became the first person with albinism to sign up with a major modeling agency.
in the modeling industry, we're looked at as something that's maybe extraterrestrial, an odd beauty, not just, you know, like a regular beauty, whatever that is. Well, here, the ratio is 1 to 20,000, and in Tanzania, it's 1 to 1,400.
Really? 1,400?
1,400.
Wow.
Diandra has become an activist, both to demystify her condition and support those who are worst affected. She takes an active role in numerous campaigns, including a UN initiative for albinism awareness. The Colorfull campaign provides scholarships and safe houses for people who are in real danger. Diandra is one of its frontline ambassadors. And she's also behind the Beyond My Skin campaign, a photography exhibition and an inspiring collection of life stories of people with albinism.
I would like for us to maybe have some sort of big brother, big sister program to mentor younger children that have albinism, for us to help parents that have children with albinism understand more what it is and how it can affect us.
Although a lot has changed since getting teased in the schoolyard, one thing hasn't. Diandra still lives in New York City, only this time with her colorful, growing family. She takes her place in a community of activists who are changing the way people view albinism and helping the world find the beauty in every possible shade of color.
Thank you. Thank you. So with that, let us begin. I'll start off by saying, full disclosure, I used to work for Sesame Workshop in their Department of Global Education about 8 years ago, overseeing specific projects in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. And as a child, growing up in Queens, New York, I was always engrossed with Sesame Street. Grover was one of my favorite characters. And, you know, I never dreamed that as an adult, I would end up teaching Grover how to pronounce words in the Arabic language. Scott, if I can ask you the first question. Sesame Street is often referred to as the longest street in the world, with over 30 co-productions or readaptations of the show Sesame Street. Tell us a bit about the different ways in which the workshop deals with the issues of race, ethnicity, both in the US and in its international programming.
Yeah, hi Zainab, nice to see you. Hi everyone. Well, when Sesame Street was created in 1969, it was created in the US at a time of tremendous social upheaval and unrest, not dissimilar to what's happening now. But Sesame Street was created as an experiment to show that people from all corners of New York City, and therefore all corners of the US in many ways, could live together in a community side by side on the same street. And when it debuted, there was a lot of resistance from pockets of the United States. There were boycotts against the fact that Black Americans and Latino Americans and white Americans were living on the same street as neighbors. And that was something that I think reflected the transition that the US was going through. It was really important for Sesame Street to show children their own lives on screen, and it still is. And there are different ways to do that. So one way is to have live action films, documentary films, where you're seeing children that look like you, no matter what that means. You're going to see a range of children and families that reflect your experiences. So that means children living in cities. It means children living in farms and suburbs and everything in between, different cultural and ethnic backgrounds, different kinds of foods. So all of that was baked into how Sesame Street was designed. But then, of course, the puppets or Muppets were a key part of that. And some Muppets were designed to be what we call humanoid, meaning they had vaguely human features like skin, quote unquote, which is Bert and Ernie is a good example. They have felt or skin, and they wear clothes, and they look like versions of kids or adults. But then there are other Muppets like Cookie Monster, who's a monster, who has long fur, is a bright color or several different colors. And so with those two approaches, we're able to be a little metaphorical in the case of monsters about what it means to have a different color of fur than somebody else in your neighborhood. And then with the more human-oriented Muppets, we're able to show a little more directly hairstyles and skin tones that are more relatable to kids in a direct way. And that combination of approaches of using real children on screen in live action documentary style footage, real children on the set interacting with different kinds of Muppets has helped us to tackle the same educational content about inclusion from different angles. And that continues. We're always questioning when we create a new character, what is the best way to deliver the educational messaging in this particular production? And sometimes that means creating Muppets that look a lot like children, that wear clothes just like children in a given context are wearing. And sometimes it means creating a monster character that isn't wearing any clothes, so that you can't project a particular cultural category onto that Muppet.
Thanks for that. And, follow-up question to that, you mentioned about the messaging and the educational messaging. And, as an educational researcher, this is obviously close to my own heart. Knowing that that is also at the heart of Sesame's work, can you and both, Terry Sue, perhaps talk about what would the educational messages be for a project that might seek to address albinism, both in the US and potentially in parts of sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, I'd love Terry Sue to tackle that. She's on the ground right now. I think she went home from set, but she's been shooting all day in Johannesburg, where this season we're focusing on diversity and inclusion again with a very special focus. So Terry Sue, I'll let you say more about that.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Zainab. So for the South African context, Takalani Sesame is the co-production of Sesame Workshop in South Africa. We were introduced in the year 2000, so that was a little bit after apartheid was formally eradicated within the country, and also sort of the early stages of reconciliation within the country. A hugely diverse population and people. We've got 11 official languages and a huge mix of races and ethnicities. And so like Scott was saying, it's important for children to be able to see themselves, people that look, like themselves represented on television. And before apartheid, that wasn't something that was very common. So that's something that Takalani Sesame, is groundbreaking in a way. And the show is designed to serve underserved children. So teaching kids across the country these big issues in their home languages, which, like I said, just wasn't available, a handful of years ago. For this season, or the last two seasons specifically, Takalani Sesame carries the underlying theme of something called Ubuntu. So Ubuntu is the concept basically of humanity. It means I am because you are. And when we break it down for our young viewers, because it is a big concept, we talk about sharing, caring, and being kind. And it's essentially showing respect for, people around you. So the show features a big cross-section of South African children and families across race, culture, language, abilities, family structure, socioeconomic backgrounds. We also managed to include a little bit of sign language in the season as well. So because we are so diverse, our aim, because the country is so diverse, our aim is to sort of showcase that. And this season, as well as the last, diversity and inclusion is one of our main educational outcomes. And the way we do it is one of the ways we do it is by letting children see people that look like them them, families that look like their families, in languages, that they speak at home, and it's not readily available on South African television. Yeah. I don't know, Scott, if you wanted to add to that.
If I can ask Diandra, maybe. Thanks, Scott. I was going to also bring in Diandra here. If that's really great to hear about how this kind of represents itself within the South African context. Diandra, can you perhaps give us some insight into a project as this that might seek to kind of talk about albinism to a early childhood audience? What would be some of the key messages that you would want something like this to actually address for children, perhaps in the U.S. context?
Hi, yes. I loved watching Sesame Street as a child, and I even enjoy watching it now with my children. So this is super exciting, and I just love how diverse Sesame Street is and how it makes you feel very happy watching it and feel very included. And I think having someone with albinism being talked about on such a large platform would be groundbreaking, because it is just so important. So I would just love to see that, to have Sesame Street talk about skincare and the different types of skin, the diversity in that, and it's just so important for children to be included in that way, and to start that at such a young age. It keeps them confident and knowing that they can achieve anything, no matter their disabilities, because with albinism, a lot of us have nystagmus or are legally blind. Some are fully blind. So to see yourself in such a positive state would be amazing.
Thank you, Diandra. So with something Terry Sue mentioned about, we know from educational research that children, at this age particularly learn best when they see themselves actually represented in these learning environments. We also know that inclusivity is something that really must be embedded in our organizations. If we can perhaps start with you, Stephan, could you talk a bit about the ways in which your organization and teams are structured to really operationalize equity and inclusion, given the international work that you do?
Sure. So, well, when I joined the NYG Foundation in 2017, our foundation was built on where the mission is to help those vulnerable and marginalized communities that have skin conditions to build healthier, more inclusive communities. So as a foundation, it's my job to go into these communities and to look at the policies and the policymakers who are building these walls. Sometimes these walls, as we all know, are invisible. And when I say policymakers, I just don't mean elected politicians, right? I also mean leaders in the healthcare industry, the leaders in schools, and all those public and private institutions that, manage our societies and have the power to build these walls. So when I joined in 2017, and Dr. David Colbert was the first one that brought people with albinism to my attention, and it was Diandra Forrest that opened my eyes. I always thought of myself as an inclusive person. I've always worked with foundations, and I always said that I was colorblind, and I didn't see color. And Diandra Forrest was the first person that told me, "Wait, Stephan, I don't want you to be colorblind. I want you to see me. My color is part of me." And it was the first time that I had to actually sit back and even look at my own inclusivity agenda and start to really reflect on how I'm approaching inclusivity. So our foundation has gone global, and when we launched the Colorfull campaign, it was all about a life full of color, and that everyone has the right to a color. Everyone. And there's no safe a neutral space between colorful and colorblind. It's about action versus inaction. It's about standing up for equal rights for all, or sitting and being silent. So I want to take this opportunity to thank Diandra, because Diandra actually coached us into this campaign. And we had brilliant creative directors, Thad Cox and Naz Nasli, who branded Colorfull. And that colorblind and colorful, no neutral space here. It's time to stand up.
Thanks for those really heartfelt reflections, Stephan. I think, two things that you highlighted really is the importance of embedding experience in the way in which you structure activity and work. And I think secondly, this idea of, diversity bypassing, which we see often in conversations around inclusivity and equity, where people say, I don't see color, and erasing individuals within this conversation. To kind of maybe build upon that, Scott, you lead, international teams as well as, a local team in New York City. Can you talk a bit about the ways in which you organize and structure your teams in order to ensure that there is equity and inclusivity?
Yes, we try to build capacity every time we create a new project and as we sustain a project. So there's always that tension between hiring people who have experience in a very focused range of skills. The production in children's media oftentimes is a very new thing for Sesame Workshop in our social impact spaces. When we started production in Bangladesh on Sesame, which is the Bangladesh version of Sesame Street, there wasn't much of a children's television industry. There certainly were not puppeteers who were trained to work with our kinds of Muppets and puppets. So we had to build a lot of capacity, and it's always a balance. It's a balance between wanting to help give opportunities to people who before then have not had the opportunities, but also needing to make sure that if we're a nonprofit, so we're funded by grants, and those grants are not open-ended. They have deliverables attached and they have deadlines attached. And so if you know that you need to produce something within 8 months, you need to have a balance of people who have experience doing what you need done, as well as people who bring perspectives and haven't had a seat at the table. And so I don't think there's one set formula for hiring in our space, except to say that we always have to question, is this person going to bring the most to the project? And if they don't have the right skill sets, but they have a framework and a perspective that we need that otherwise is lacking or that has not been given voice, then how can we support that person in other ways? So as we build budgets for new projects, we have started building in line items in our budgets to help build that capacity. A good example is when we're writing scripts, we have a really formatted show, meaning we do a lot of research and we build on 51 years of research to design kind of second by second what should be happening in the episodes. And so we need writers who are able to really do that and do it quickly and do it in a funny way and still be educational. And it's really hard, even for experienced writers of children's television. It's a really hard thing to do. So we can't expect writers who are brand new to it to hit it out of the park every time. So we have added into our budgets line items for story editors to be kind of mentors, but also to be that last kind of touch point for script writers, so that if they're not quite getting it, or if a scene isn't quite funny enough, the story editor can help shape that and help show them, this is what I think we should do here to make it funnier. And usually that really helps that writer on the next script to grow.
Thank you, Scott. I just want to take a moment to just say to the audience, please feel free to put in questions to the chat. We will have kind of a dedicated question and answer series, a question and answer session towards the end, but also I'm very happy to kind of incorporate questions as they come up. So, you know, the title of the session is in intersectionality. And when we talk about intersectionality, we really, you know, understand that individuals are characterized by a number of personal characteristics as well as, you know, social conditions. For each of you in the work that you do, you know, recognizing that each of you have different positionalities and the context in which you work in, can you talk a bit about how this shows up in your areas of work every single day? How do you then engage with this and your teams with this concept? And maybe Stephan, if you want to start off, you know.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. So I have to admit, I really have to admit that when I saw that word, I had to actually look it up. I looked at intersectionality, and I've been working in the development world for over 20 years, and I actually had to look up that word. And then when I saw it, I said, oh, these are things that I and most of us, many of us, experience and feel every single day. Identities and the multiple identities that we own, that we have, and the scars that we carry with them. And because we're dealing with Colorfull and albinism, if you have albinism, the identities that you own expose you to not only violence, but to extreme violence, not only to discrimination, but to extreme discrimination. Have any of you ever met a teenage boy or two teenage girls that have had their limbs cut off so that their limbs can be used in a tonic that could bring wealth and happiness to the drinker, to the potion? That's their identity. Their identities are exposing them to gross violations of human rights. And if you're not poached for your body, are you going to be bullied out of school because many people with albinism are legally blind? That's another identity. They're legally blind. And so in Africa, where they can't see the board or they're tripping, they don't have cane, they can't see, they're bullied out of school. And if they're bullied out of school and they're not poached for their limbs, what about if you refused entry into a health center or healthcare? Or what happens if doctors can't treat you? Because, by the way, people with albinism have one of the highest rates of skin cancer around the world because they have no melanin, no protection. So bullied out of school, poached for your limbs, or have no access to healthcare. All the identities and the scars that they carry with them. Intersectionality, a word that I looked up and understood. And obviously, I share some of these identities and I feel them and I carry these scars. But when you look at people with albinism and the scars that they carry because of their identities, there are no words to describe the gross violations of human rights that people with albinism face today. None. And this is our job. Like I was, there is no neutral space between colorful and colorblind. It's action versus inaction. And that's what Colorfull is all about, to change behavior. Now with kindness, but it is to change behavior. And education through Sesame Street is fundamental. It is an agent of change for us.
Stephan, thank you for highlighting that good feelings of kindness and niceness are not going to help us out of some of these challenges, and that action is necessary and needed. Diandra, if I can pick back up with you to talk a bit from the U.S. context. You know, I know that part of the work of Sesame Street is really about kind of dispelling negative and negative stereotypes. Can you talk a bit about, what the experience, so contrary to some of the stuff Stephan was mentioning in the international context outside of your own, what are the experiences and challenges in reference to intersectionality for albino people?
Yes, well, some of the challenges were and are definitely with people understanding why I am, or how I am a Black African-American woman with such light skin, and the other things that come with that, nystagmus, legally blindness. And I must say people now are more aware of albinism and what that is, but even I model as well, and even in my workspace of being legally blind, sometimes when I'm doing shoots or runway, it's really hard to explain to people that I can't see something, and when they can see that you can see. So, and it's more of in that space for me right now, visually. So yeah, it's just really about people being more understanding, being able to spread knowledge about what albinism really is, and people being more willing to learn.
Thank you, Diandra. Scott, perhaps you can give some examples from your own context and working at Sesame Workshop, and what does intersectionality mean in your context, and how does that show up in your daily work?
Well, similar to what I was talking about in building the team to produce something, oftentimes it's very early in the process. We need to find out who are the voices that we're representing. And as we all know, there are these terrible ripple effects from economic disadvantage and racism and prejudice that mean that there are fewer people in positions of authority or power to help at every stage. So for example, when we start a project, we do a needs assessment, and we conduct research in communities, and we also pull together educational advisors. And we want those educational advisors to always represent the breadth of our target audience and the lived experiences of our target audience. But not every educational advisor is going to be able to represent every group, and not every educational advisor is going to agree on the best way forward. So, for example, when we created Ahlan Simsim in the Middle East, we needed to decide what kind of Arabic we would be speaking in the show, and whether we would be speaking formal academic Arabic, Fusha, or we would be using a more colloquial version, which is what children speak. And although Fusha is preferable to teachers and ministers of education, it's not preferable if you're a child trying to learn about how to name and identify your emotions, or how to talk to your friends about, hey, you're different than me a little bit. I want to know more about that. These are really sensitive, nuanced topics, as Stephan and Diandra were saying, around people living with albinism. Children are curious and they want to know things. So we need to give them language that they'll actually use. So in the Middle East, as we were struggling with Arabic, we had to be intersectional in the way we pulled together advisors. Even though these were advisors who all had been through PhD programs, we also needed to bring in people who were practitioners. They were preschool teachers without advanced degrees, and they were people who represented underrepresented communities. And we needed to build a constellation of inputs and not just rely on the established authorities as the only way forward. Because if we did that, we would be missing out on the lived experience of people who haven't had access to all of the kind of levers of power and authority.
And maybe I can just add to that in the South African context. I think that it's also about not making assumptions, on behalf of a certain group of people, and then also, finding a balance when we are dealing with our young audiences about showcasing representation, but also not isolating as we showcase the diversity. So in our most recent season that is on air at the moment, like I said, it's a wide sort of cross-section of South African children that we have on the show and their families. And one of our stories focused on 2 young children from the same culture. They were both from the Sepedi culture, so they share language. They share culture. One was a young girl with dark skin, and one was a little boy that was living with albinism. And our actual story was about their, common bond and, how they spoke the same languages and had the same background. But we also did subtly speak about the difference in their appearance, just in terms of their skin color and for the little boy, having to wear a hat and, always make sure that his skin was taken care of. But at the same time, we are dealing with the children that appear on Takalani Sesame are real children with real lived experiences rather than hired actors. And so at the same time, there's a balance between having this young boy and the young girl speak about their lived experiences and backgrounds, but also for him, that's his reality, that's his day-to-day. And so at home, where he's from, the school that he goes to, he's not daily speaking about the differences of him living with albinism. He's speaking about the common bonds that he has with children. So there's always that fine balance of showcasing, balance of representation, but also not isolating as we showcase that diversity.
Thanks so much, Terry Sue. I think that's, ending on that point is quite important to, ensure, that there isn't tokenization that's being embedded into the way in which diversity is approached. I'm going to take some questions for the audience. And, I think I'll go about it by just asking perhaps individually in the interest of time. So the first question is around what lessons from everyone's work over the years might be shared with business leaders who are building inclusive cultures. So maybe Stephan, if I can ask you to start off with that.
Sorry, repeat that last name. So there's a little cut off. There's a little delay there. One more time. Sorry, that last part.
So what if you could have, what would be the one lesson that you would want to communicate to business leaders as they're looking to build inclusive cultures or teams?
Yes. Scott said a good word there before, is making sure that we're inviting everyone to this table, right, and providing them a plate of equal opportunities. And what I've realized working on our albinism, our Colorfull campaign albinism, is, well, it's not only inviting them, but how do you assist them to actually get to the table, right? So if you look at this community, if you look at people with albinism, if they're already pushed out of school and you can't even see them, well, they won't even know that there's an invitation out there for them to participate. So the message to corporate leaders or to leaders, to policymakers, is sometimes you actually have to go out and find them and assist them to get to the table, because they are underrepresented and they've been in the shadows for such a long time that they're not seeing our invitation. So be more actively engaged in recruiting, in assisting them to get to the table. Just don't think that sending out an invitation is enough, and that if you didn't get a response, they didn't respond. You really have to stand up and take extra steps to get them, to assist them to walk to the table.
Thanks so much for that, Stephan. I think you highlighted an important point about the level of intentionality of making the invisible visible and how to do that. So thank you for that reflection. Second question, and to Scott, we have a question from Alistair, who says, how do Sesame how does Sesame measure the success of their programs with young people to demonstrate that the approach works? So maybe you can talk about what the measurements of success are for programming.
Absolutely. And if I could just tag on to something that Stephan just said, I think it's really important for all business leaders and all leaders really to understand that the burden shouldn't be on the people you're bringing to the table who haven't been represented equally before. It shouldn't be on them to explain their position or to articulate their particular context or lived experience. We can't put it all on the people who are already struggling to represent something that hasn't been represented. So we need to give tools to the people who are in more positions of authority in companies and in organizations. We need to give them tools so that they feel more comfortable talking, because otherwise people never address things, I think, and they end up asking newcomers to the company to represent their underrepresented group. So. But in answer to the question you asked, Zainab, we do a lot of formative research as we go. So as soon as we write a script for a new show or a new idea, we will turn it into a rough animatic, which is like it's not quite animated. It's more like a storybook that comes to life with audio on it. And we test that with children and with families. And we watch them as they watch that animatic. We watch to see if they're engaged, and we do pre and post testing with them so that before they watch it, we find out, let's say it's about triangles. We find out if they know what triangles are. And then after they watch the segment or the episode about triangles, we do further research. We ask them again, what do you know about triangles? And that's how we can track, is this segment actually working? Is it having an educational impact? And then when funders give us money to do longitudinal studies, like we're doing in the Middle East right now and in the Rohingya context, we can track a much bigger portion of our audience and track them over time to see if a larger dose of the content will have an impact. And we've learned at Sesame that we have to really focus in on just a few educational goals in a given season in order to have the kind of impact we need. The original Sesame Street had a lot of different educational goals in one episode: counting, letters, sharing, pro-social goals, cooperation. We try to focus on just 2 or 3 per season and reiterate and come at them from different angles. And that's how we see real impact in what we do.
Thanks for that, Scott. I think your point that you highlighted in the beginning of your comments is quite important about, the burden of responsibility. I think encouraging and recognizing that not only should people who have been marginalized or aggressed in, specific environments be the ones that have to articulate what the challenges have been, but it's also the responsibilities of those who have been in positions of power to communicate why things have been the way they are and to articulate how things are going to change. So it is very much a comprehensive conversation needs to be had from all parties. I want to ask Terry Sue a bit about South Africa, and we have Cami, for instance, who is the Muppet that is HIV positive. What lessons have you learned from engaging with Cami as a Muppet in the context that people can learn from to destigmatize negative stereotypes of various people?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So Cami, for those who don't know, she's a 5-year-old AIDS orphan Muppet who lives within the Takalani Sesame world. She was introduced in 2002 when South Africa was really at the height of our AIDS pandemic. And at the time, there were a lot of false ideas around what it meant to live with HIV and AIDS. And so Cami was introduced to help debunk some of those sort of stereotypes. So simple truths, again, obviously for a very young audience, so simple truths like, playing with somebody on the playground or hugging them, that's not how you contract the virus. And so she was really, for such a young character, she was really instrumental in shifting the stigma around HIV and AIDS for our young audience, but also for their caregivers who were watching the show. And she's been around nearly 20 years now, and she's still looked upon in that way. In South Africa, the pandemic is not as intense as it was in the early 2000s, although it's still, it's definitely predominant. But Cami was really sort of instrumental in shifting the stigma and teaching those basic lessons to young children and their caregivers.
Thank you, Terry Sue. So, this is for maybe, all of the panelists. This is a question from Zohir Uddin. In largely homogenous societies, how can leaders encourage the celebration of difference?
Do you want to, sorry, are we starting?
So any, maybe Stefana, you want to start us off. How can, in homogenous societies, how would you say that leaders can, encourage and approach kindness towards difference?
There's, I think this would be, someone mentioned, maybe Terry or Scott, there's fear, right? There's a lack of understanding. There's fear. They don't look like us. They're not like us. And it's really interesting. In traveling, I've worked in several countries, from Afghanistan to Iraq to now northern Cambodia. There's a real lack of understanding, and sometimes the lack of understanding goes to fear, and there's all of a sudden these walls that go up, and they create these groups, and now all of a sudden there are these racial groups, and they're different. They look different, and therefore they are different. And it's like, well, okay, yes, let's start with, we're all human. Well, let's start with humanity. We have a life, we're human, the full life of a human being, and let's celebrate our differences, right? Let's celebrate our identities and what we all bring to the table. But what I've definitely noticed, the theme of misunderstandings, myth debunking, myth dismantling, especially regarding albinism. I mean, it's all built on myth, right? That they're magical creatures. So there's a lot of understanding, and added to that layers of myth, and you need to dismantle that by working with religious leaders, by working with politicians, with working with media, with working with teachers, business leaders, healthcare workers, all stakeholders in society. And it's about it. It's like we keep saying with Sesame Street, it's about educating them. It's about education.
So we have a few more minutes left. That we might have time for a couple of more questions. So I thought maybe you could speak to this from your experience and as a model, as an activist. Saiful Islam asks finally, as a proliferation of social media and creation of new consumption platforms such as TikTok Challenge, what are the issues that you see and things that are related to DEI, and how are adaptive strategies for Gen Z and younger changing for this generation? What are the things that are on their mind that you see related to issues of diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I started modeling during a time where there weren't these apps and so many social media platforms. There was only Facebook and MySpace. So now with having so many platforms, I think there are amazing things and there are things that can give us a little bit of anxiety. The good things about it is that we do have access to more knowledge. We see pictures of people who look different and beautiful photos, and that makes us question, okay, why do they look like this, or what is this? And it intrigues us, and we get to have a sneak peek into their life and learn more about them without feeling a little bit embarrassed, because I know from experience growing up, sometimes you ask questions and you get, in trouble, so to say, for asking certain things. So now with having these platforms, you can see different things and find out and learn more about them without having to ask the person directly. But I think the negative side of that also is that there is a lot of internet bullying, and there is a lot of, people, things aren't as they seem. So I think people look at other people's pictures, and with the filters and the editing, they think, oh, it's a problem. I don't look this way, or I have a blemish. And, there's a lot when it comes to beauty in that sense. Everyone is trying to achieve perfection, and, we're all, no one is perfect, and we are perfect just the way we are. So I think it's very important for that to be the takeaway. Just us being our own perfect selves, and that just to celebrate our differences and to create more conversations about what the differences, and
Thank you, Diandra. I want to ask one final question, and perhaps we can kind of go through each of the panelists and maybe very quickly with a sentence or two. So this is obviously a challenging topic and requires action. As said, Anand asks, what do your leaders at work or in the community don't take inclusion at all seriously? If they dismiss it as some kind of woolly liberal thing, how do you effectively get them to engage?
Okay, it's interesting what you're saying. Listen, we still have many fossils in power, right? Yes. That's the reality. We all know that, and we know that fossils belong in museums where we can look at them and say, oh, look what history was like. So how I look at it is that it takes years, decades to change behavior. We know that, decades to change behavior. So, but the key is you're not only targeting one person, one leader, you're targeting all stakeholders. You're going after the leaders in schools, you're going after media, you're going after religious leaders, you're going after a variety of actors, stakeholders in our community. So eventually, that one person who is still a fossil will eventually be removed from that position. It certainly will take time, that is for sure. And working in these developing economies and spending decades in rural communities and seeing how sometimes it just takes a decade and more to change that kind of behavior. You go after all stakeholders in the community. You don't focus on one person. It's the entire communal. It's a communal responsibility.
Scott?
I mean, this could be another really rich conversation. There's so much to talk about here. I think what I see a lot in our work is that people think of diversity and inclusion as binary. You're either inclusive or you're not. And that is really dangerous to me, because in any given subculture that you're trying to represent, there's going to be diversity. And so diversity isn't you either do this or you do that. It's a mindset about being open to diversity. It's being open to a range of approaches. And I think we need to incentivize businesses and organizations so that exploring those nuances and exploring diversity is linked to their measures of success, their deliverables, for example. So in Sesame, we set goals for what our projects should accomplish, and we try to bake into those goals reflections of diversity, and then we try to think ahead about how are we going to measure that so that we're held accountable. And I think it's that accountability, because a lot of people want to have a more diverse workplace or make more diverse content, but diversity means different things to each individual. And so we have to, I think, step back from that binary mindset and think about incentivizing people to keep looking for additional voices and celebrate additional voices.
Terry Sue, your final thoughts? What do we do when leadership doesn't acknowledge that diversity and inclusion is something that we need to attend to?
So that's, something that as a South African, I've really lived through. But I think sort of in general, and like Scott was saying, could probably have a whole other session just on that. But in general, I would say, it's about not making assumptions. It's about being open to ongoing learning. It's about being open to shifting sort of and challenging cultural norms and sort of our ideas of how things are and how they should be. That's not necessarily, with leadership, although it does, it does link that way too. But it all sort of starts on the ground, I would say, for people's day-to-day. But definitely within South Africa, because of apartheid, that is something that we have all lived through, regardless of the color of, your skin or sort of what cultural background you come from.
Thank you. And Diandra, your final thoughts?
Yes, I think Terry, Scott, and Stephan definitely hit the nail right on the head. And I do think it's us just being more inclusive, more open to things that we don't understand and more willing to learn will definitely put us in a better space. Because it is that's what it's all about to me. That's why I think creating more campaigns like the Colorfull campaign and having platforms like Sesame Street where we can learn and where we can share our experiences so people can understand is what's really important.
And with that, we'll end the session. Thank you everyone for an engaging conversation. A special thanks to Stephan for facilitating the introduction to the panelists for this conversation. Some of what we heard from our panelists is that we must challenge the norms across our teams and organizations. Saying I don't see color erases the presence of individuals within our society and masks a refusal to educate oneself. Teaching children through educational media is a powerful way to demonstrate diversity and inclusion. Bringing people to the table must be intentional and requires you to go out and find people, not solely relying on traditional open calls. And lastly, the burden of responsibility is on you and not those who have been marginalized to learn how to make your organizations and teams diverse and inclusive. A recording of the event will be available on the SBS website in the coming days. The second episode of the Intersectionality and Inclusion series on December 3rd, moderated by Dr. Bridget Custon, will discuss intersectionality and feminism. Dr. Custon will guide a conversation with panelists on work in male-dominated sectors in the field of sustainability and climate change. You can find more information and register at sbs.ox.ac.uk. Thank you for joining us this evening.